tens of thousands of pages, gone, quietly removed. In the middle of the night, the government said, "Nothing is hidden." But journalists were counting every single page, and the numbers did not match. Pages connected to one of the most powerful men in the world disappeared. And when Congress demanded answers, something extraordinary happened. Within 24 hours, they were back. But here's the question nobody's answering. Why were they removed in the first place? And more importantly, how many pages are still missing? Welcome to Currency Archives, the place where we follow the money and ask the questions others are afraid to ask. Now, before we go further, if you are watching this right now, I want you to do something for me. Think of it like your morning newspaper. You wouldn't throw it away before reading it, would you? So don't leave this channel before hitting that subscribe button. It takes 1 second. And trust me, at your age, you've earned the right to stay informed. Now, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this from? Because this story affects all of us. The year was 2025, and something unusual was happening inside one of the most closely watched document databases in American history. Quietly, slowly, page by page, records were disappearing, not in a dramatic way, not with headlines or announcements, but in the way that powerful institutions have always preferred, silently, methodically, and without explanation. The Epstein files had been one of the most anticipated document releases in recent memory. For years, the public had demanded answers. For years, they had been told to wait. And when the files finally appeared in a government database, journalists, researchers, and ordinary citizens rushed to examine them. But some of those journalists noticed something strange. They had been tracking the documents carefully, not just reading them, but cataloging them by serial number. And when they compared what was available now to what had been available before, the numbers did not add up. Pages were missing, not a few, not a dozen, tens of thousands. To understand why this matters, one must first understand what these files represented. Jeffrey Epstein was not simply a criminal, he was a connector. A man who moved through the highest levels of finance, politics, and global power with remarkable ease. His network included politicians, businessmen, scientists, and world leaders. His arrest in 2019 and subsequent death in a federal jail cell left behind a trail of unanswered questions that stretched across continents. The files that bore his name were never just about one man. They were about a system, a network, a way of operating that existed far above the reach of ordinary law. When those files were made public, they represented something rare, a window into that world. And so, when pages began disappearing from that window, the people watching noticed immediately. The journalists who tracked the deletions did not raise an alarm based on feeling or suspicion. They raised it based on data. By cross-referencing serial numbers and document identifiers, they were able to map the shape of what had been removed. And what they found was not random. The pattern of missing pages appeared to cluster around specific names, specific testimonies, and specific allegations. Many of the absent documents, they reported, were connected to allegations involving Donald Trump. This was not a minor detail. This was the thread that, once pulled, began to unravel something far larger. When members of Congress began asking questions, the Department of Justice responded with confidence. Nothing had been hidden, they said. Attorney General Pam Bondi stood before Congress and testified under oath. There was, she stated plainly, no evidence that Trump had committed a crime. The database was intact. The process had been transparent. But the journalists kept counting, and the numbers told a different story. By the time independent investigators completed their analysis, they estimated that the public database had grown more than 65,000 pages shorter than its original release. The DOJ would later acknowledge that over 47,000 files had been taken offline, describing the action as a temporary measure for further review. Temporary for further review. Words that governments have used throughout history when they wish to remove something from public view without admitting that it was ever hidden at all. For the business community and the entrepreneurs watching this story unfold, there is a lesson here that goes beyond politics. When public institutions begin removing information from public access, particularly information connected to individuals of significant power and wealth, it sends a signal. That signal travels through markets, through boardrooms, and through the decisions of anyone who depends on a stable, transparent system of law and governance to conduct their affairs. Trust is not abstract. Trust is economic. When people cannot rely on official records to remain intact, when they cannot trust that what the government says matches what the government does, they begin to adjust their behavior accordingly. The disappearance of 65,000 pages was not merely a political event. It was a warning. And in the weeks that followed, that warning would grow louder. There's an old saying in the corridors of power. It is not what you know. It is not even who you know. It is what you can make disappear. And in the early weeks of 2025, something very significant had been made to disappear. The question that Washington was now asking, quietly, carefully, and with considerable nervousness, was not simply what had been removed from the Epstein database. The question was, who had been protected by its removal? When journalists first began reporting that pages connected to Donald Trump were missing from the public database, the initial response from official channels was dismissal. These were conspiracy theories, some said. Misinterpretations of a complex archiving process, said others. The database was functioning normally. The government had nothing to hide. But the journalists were not speculating, they were counting. And what they counted told a story that no official statement could fully erase. The missing documents were not scattered randomly across the database. They followed a pattern, a shape. And that shape, when examined carefully, pointed consistently toward one direction, toward testimonies, interview summaries, and investigative notes that contained references to one of the most powerful political figures in the United States. This was no longer a story about missing paperwork. This was a story about who controls the truth. Attorney General Pam Bondi had taken her position at the Department of Justice during one of the most politically charged moments in recent American history. She was not an unknown figure. She had a record. She had allies. And she had, by the time she appeared before Congress, a very specific message to deliver. She delivered it under oath. There was, she testified, no evidence that Donald Trump had committed a crime. The Epstein files had been handled appropriately. The process had been transparent and lawful. She said this with the calm confidence of someone who believed the matter was settled. But across Washington, in the offices of the House Oversight Committee, a different calculation was being made. The House Oversight Committee is not an institution that moves quickly. It is deliberate, procedural, and deeply political. For it to act, and to act decisively, something significant must have shifted. On March 4th, something did. The committee voted 24-19 to issue a formal subpoena to Attorney General Pam Bondi. The subpoena demanded answers. It demanded documents. It demanded an accounting of exactly what had been removed from the Epstein database, when it had been removed, and under whose authority. But it was not the vote itself that sent shockwaves through Washington. It was the composition of that vote. 5 Republican members of the committee crossed party lines to support the subpoena. In the current political climate, where party loyalty has become almost absolute, this was not a minor procedural gesture. This was a statement. 5 members of the same party as the president looked at the evidence before them and decided that what they saw could not be ignored. For those who study institutions, and for the entrepreneurs and business leaders who depend on those institutions to function predictably, this moment carried a meaning that extended far beyond partisan politics. When a government's own members begin breaking ranks over the handling of sensitive legal documents, it signals something fundamental. It signals that the internal pressure to suppress information has become greater than the political cost of exposing it. That is a dangerous threshold to cross. History offers many examples of governments that controlled information with great skill, until they could not. The moment of failure is rarely dramatic at first. It begins exactly like this, with a vote, with 5 unexpected hands raised in a room where everyone expected silence. Not an apology, not an explanation, not a careful, measured statement from the nation's chief law enforcement body, acknowledging that questions had been raised and that answers would be provided. Instead, the DOJ took to social media. They called the subpoena laughable. That single word, laughable, spoken by an institution under formal congressional investigation, revealed something important about the state of accountability in America at that moment. Power, when truly threatened, does not become humble, it becomes loud. And what came next would force even the loudest voices in Washington into a silence they had not anticipated. In the history of American governance, very few things move fast. Legislation takes months. Investigations take years. Justice, when it arrives at all, arrives slowly, carefully wrapped in procedure, precedent, and patience. But on March 5th, 2025, something moved with extraordinary speed. And that speed itself was the most revealing detail of the entire story. The day before, Congress had voted to subpoena the Attorney General of the United States. 5 members of the president's own party had raised their hands against the administration. The message from Capitol Hill had been clear, direct, and impossible to misinterpret. Produce the documents, answer the questions, or face the consequences. For weeks, the Department of Justice had maintained its position with unwavering confidence. The database was intact. The process had been transparent. Nothing had been hidden. These were not suggestions or estimates. These were sworn statements delivered before Congress by the nation's top law enforcement official. And then, within 24 hours of the subpoena vote, everything changed. On the morning of March 5th, the Department of Justice made an announcement that stunned even the most seasoned observers of Washington politics. The files would be restored. Not gradually, not over weeks or months, not through a careful, methodical process of review and reintegration. In a single day, approximately 25,000 images were reposted to the public Epstein database. 25,000 in one day. For an institution that had spent weeks insisting that nothing was missing, this was a remarkable admission wrapped inside an operational decision, because the speed of that restoration raised a question that no official statement attempted to answer. If the files had been removed for legitimate review, as the DOJ had claimed, how had that review been completed so quickly? Proper document review does not happen overnight. It does not happen in response to a subpoena vote on a Tuesday and conclude by Wednesday morning. Anyone who has worked inside a large institution, legal, financial, or governmental, understands this fundamental reality. Reviews take time, unless, of course, the review was never the real reason for the removal. But the restoration of files was only half of what made that day remarkable. It was posting. The DOL called the subpoena laughable. That word had now appeared twice, first spoken, then written publicly for the entire world to read. An institution under formal congressional investigation, an institution that had just spent the previous night restoring tens of thousands of documents it had previously denied removing, was using social media to mock the oversight body demanding accountability. This contradiction was not lost on observers. On one hand, the DOJ was acting, restoring files, acknowledging through action, if not through words, that something had indeed been taken offline. On the other hand, it was performing, projecting confidence, using the language of dismissal to signal to its political allies that it remained unbothered and in control. These two things cannot both be true simultaneously. And the business community, the investors, the strategists, the entrepreneurs who watch institutional behavior not for entertainment but for economic signals, understood exactly what this contradiction meant. When institutions act against their own stated positions under external pressure, it reveals the distance between their public narrative and their private reality. That distance is called risk. The documents that were restored were not trivial records. Among the materials reposted were FBI interview summaries, detailed accounts of conversations between federal investigators and witnesses who had direct knowledge of Epstein's network and operations. Some of those summaries, journalists reported, contained references to powerful individuals, references that had been absent from the database during the weeks of quiet removal, references that were now, suddenly and without formal explanation, available again. Investigators and researchers who had been tracking the database from the beginning began the painstaking work of comparing what had returned against what had originally been released. What they found was both clarifying and deeply unsettling. Even with 25,000 images restored in a single day, the database was still significantly smaller than its original form. Independent analysis suggested that the gap between the original release and the current public database remained substantial. Journalists who had been counting from the beginning estimated that tens of thousands of pages were still unaccounted for. The DOJ had moved, but it had not moved far enough. For the lawmakers who had voted for the subpoena, the partial restoration was confirmation of what they had suspected all along. The removal had not been routine. The review had not been standard procedure. And the speed of the reversal, 25,000 files in a single day after weeks of denial, was not the behavior of an institution that had been conducting a careful, legitimate archiving process. It was the behavior of an institution that had been caught. For entrepreneurs and business leaders, this moment carries a lesson that transcends politics entirely. In any organization, corporate, governmental, or financial, the moment of forced reversal is the moment of maximum exposure. It is the point at which the gap between what was said and what was done becomes impossible to close with words alone. When that gap is exposed inside a government responsible for maintaining the legal and institutional frameworks within which business operates, the consequences extend far beyond the immediate controversy. They ripple through regulatory confidence, through investor trust, through the quiet calculations of every serious decision-maker who watches how power responds when it is cornered. The files had come back, but the questions they carried with them had not gone anywhere. And in the weeks ahead, those questions would reach into places that even the most optimistic observers had not yet begun to examine. There are moments in history that appear, on the surface, to be political scandals, arguments between institutions, disputes over documents, votes in committee rooms that most ordinary people never hear about and quickly forget. But beneath the surface of those moments, beneath the procedural language and the press statements and the carefully worded denials, something far more significant is taking place. A system is revealing itself. And what the Epstein files controversy revealed in the closing weeks of this extraordinary sequence of events was not simply a story about missing documents or political maneuvering. It was a story about how power actually works. And more importantly, for the entrepreneurs, the investors, and the business leaders watching closely, it was a story about what happens to economies, institutions, and trust when that power operates without accountability. Jeffrey Epstein did not build his network through talent alone. He built it through access to money, access to influence, access to the kind of rooms where decisions are made that shape industries, governments, and financial systems. He moved between the worlds of high finance, political power, and global elite networks with a fluency that took years to construct, and that served a very specific purpose. He was useful to powerful people, and powerful people throughout history have always protected what is useful to them. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is an observable pattern, one that repeats itself across centuries, across continents, and across every major system of organized power that human beings have ever constructed. The files that bore Epstein's name were never simply a record of one man's crimes. They were a partial map of a network that connected financial institutions, political offices, and centers of global influence in ways that the public had never been permitted to fully examine. When those files began disappearing, it was not the documents themselves that mattered most. It was what their disappearance confirmed. By the time the full timeline of events had been assembled, from the quiet removals of late February to the congressional subpoena of March 4th to the mass restoration of March 5th, several things had become undeniably clear. First, the removal of documents from a public federal database had not been a routine archiving decision. The speed of the reversal, the pattern of the missing pages, and the nature of the materials involved made that explanation impossible to sustain. Third, and most significantly for anyone studying the long-term implications of this story, the system of oversight that was designed to prevent exactly this kind of situation had functioned only partially, and only under extreme pressure. It had taken independent journalists, counting serial numbers in a public database, to surface what the government's own transparency mechanisms had failed to reveal. That is not a functioning system of accountability. That is a system surviving on the vigilance of individuals operating outside it. For the business community, this distinction carries enormous weight. Every serious investor, every strategic entrepreneur, every executive responsible for making long-term decisions understands that their ability to operate depends on something that economists call institutional trust. Institutional trust is the confidence that contracts will be enforced, that legal protections will be honored, that the rules governing commerce, property, and dispute resolution will be applied consistently and transparently, regardless of who is involved and regardless of how much power they hold. When that trust erodes, when it becomes visible that institutions are capable of removing public records, denying that removal under oath, and then reversing course only when forced to by congressional subpoena, the signal that sends through the economic system is not subtle. It is a warning. And warnings in economics as in medicine are most valuable when they are received early, before the damage they predict has fully arrived. Several members of Congress from both major parties continued to press for the release of all remaining Epstein documents in the weeks following the partial restoration. Their argument was straightforward. If the files contained nothing damaging, if the review process had been legitimate, if the temporary removal had been routine and the restoration complete, then there was no reason for any document to remain withheld. The fact that questions about completeness persisted, that independent analysts continued to report significant gaps between the original release and the current public database, suggested that the story had not yet reached its conclusion. Some lawmakers stated publicly that the files contained references to individuals of significant power and influence connected to Epstein's network. Others were more cautious, acknowledging only that the materials raised serious questions that demanded serious answers. What both groups agreed on was this: the public had not yet seen everything. For those who study how great powers manage information, and how the management of information shapes economic outcomes, the Epstein files controversy offers a case study of unusual clarity. It demonstrates how institutions respond when sensitive information intersects with concentrated power. It demonstrates how the language of procedure and review can be used to create distance between a decision and its true motivation. And it demonstrates how accountability, when it arrives at all, arrives not because institutions choose transparency, but because external pressure makes concealment more costly than disclosure. This is the calculus of power, and it operates the same way whether one is examining a government database in Washington, a corporate boardroom in New York, or a financial institution in any major city in the world. The lesson for entrepreneurs and business leaders is not that governments are corrupt or that systems are broken beyond repair. The lesson is more precise than that. The lesson is that transparency does not maintain itself. It must be demanded, tracked, verified, and when it fails, as it failed here, the failure must be documented, analyzed, and understood for what it truly represents. Not a political controversy, a systemic warning. As more documents continue to emerge from the Epstein investigation, the central question that defined this entire controversy remains unanswered. How much of the truth has the public actually seen, and how much, carefully reviewed, quietly held, protected by institutions whose first obligation should be to the people they serve, still remains hidden? That question does not belong only to journalists or lawmakers or political activists. It belongs to every person who depends on a transparent, accountable system of governance to conduct their lives, build their businesses, and plan their futures. Because when the files disappear, and when they come back, and when no one in authority can fully explain why either thing happened, the real document that has gone missing is not one that can be found in any database. It is trust itself. And once that disappears, restoring it takes far longer than a single day.